大家好, I'm Nathan Rich, aka 火锅大王. The founder of the cult called the Moonies, which is basically a violent Scientology for Koreans, is Sun Myung Moon. When he wasn't claiming to be the Messiah and second coming of Christ, for more information read up on the Antichrist, he spent much time lashing out against communism, waiting for God to exterminate all of the gays, and trying to affect American politics in favor of Israel. Lately, his cult, which again claims that he is literally the return of Jesus Christ, has been praised by Donald Trump and has featured such speakers as notable anti-peace activists, or excuse me, I think we call them neocons, Mike Pence and Mike Pompeo. But aside from having our political class licking from their hands, the Moonies also run an anti-China tabloid called the Washington Times. And it was in the Washington Times that I first came across a doozy of an article by Kwok-Yue at the Hoover Institution. The gist of the article is that China, or more specifically the communists of China, don't deserve to celebrate China's victory in World War II because reasons. So who is this Miles guy? And wouldn't it be a little embarrassing for him if he turned out to be an alleged top China expert, only to be completely obliterated and debunked thoroughly by me, a completely random nobody? No, it would be extremely embarrassing. As many of you have heard, the world is gearing up to celebrate the end of World War II, as this year marks the 80th anniversary of its close. But Kwok-Yue wants you to know that China's celebration will be a supreme fiction. Who is Miles, you ask? He's a senior fellow and director of the China Center at Hudson Institute. He's also a professor of East Asia, military, and naval history at the United States Naval Academy. He specializes in Chinese military and strategic culture, U.S. and Chinese military and diplomatic history, and U.S. policy toward China. He also was on the Trump administration and served as a China policy advisor to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. He's also a member of something called the Military History Contemporary Conflict Working Group, which is a neocon research group. He also apparently worked for Radio Free Asia, the state propaganda outlet. In addition to his support of the Korean Antichrist cult, he also enjoys making contributions to the official Falun Gong blog, The Epoch Times. He has been awarded many times, including with the US Naval Academy's Top Researcher Award. Top Researcher. And as a government-funded top neocon researcher, he thinks that China shouldn't celebrate the end of World War II. Why, you ask? Maybe you're thinking it's inappropriate, like we should be more respectful of the dead or something. No, maybe he finds it strange the way that I do, that we call this entire conflict in China, which started at least as far back as 1931, part of World War II. Nope, that's not it either. Miles thinks that China's celebration of the end of World War II will be a supreme fiction because he's a complete and total fraud, a supreme clown. Let's take a look at his article, China's World War II Victory Parade, a Supreme Fiction. The subtitle is Fabricated Photos, False Narratives, and Upcoming Celebrations Based on Lies. First, a little bit of background for anyone not immediately familiar with the broad strokes of this period of history. World War I was a war that we have a pretty clean timeline for. We know roughly how it started and how it ended, but World War II, however, is a bit strange because Japan started soft invading China in the early 1900s, and then ramped it up in 1931, and then ramped it up again in 1932, and then ramped it up fully in 1937. The European War didn't start until 1939. But it wasn't until later that we started calling all of this a world war. Then it became very confusing as to when the war actually started. If Japan's invasion of China, which had literally nothing at all to do with any kind of world war, was part of World War II, that would suggest that World War II started in 1931, or at least 1937. Anyway, this all just goes to show you that the timeline for this is very much open for interpretation. Furthermore, China didn't consider itself in any kind of world war. It was being invaded by a single country long before any other countries cared. Hell, the US was supplying weapons to Japan so that it could continue killing the Chinese. It wasn't until later that everyone kind of decided that some or all of the war was part of World War. And that's something that has massively diminished the Sino-Japanese War, in my opinion anyway, because now in the eyes of many Westerners, the entire experience in China is just wrapped into some European war about Nazis. In reality, it was not much related to what we call World War II at all. China, at the time Japan invaded, was run in part by a fascist leader, a few rival warlords, and a few groups of communists. The United States sided with Chiang Kai-shek, who was the leader of his own version of the Republic of China, which is very often confused with many other versions of the Republic of China, which often existed simultaneously with one another and were often in conflict with each other. But the point is, the US was sided with the internationally recognized government of China. And though there were at times various factions and groups of communists, because they all eventually coalesced into an early version of the Communist Party of China, CPC as they're called, or CCP if you're Mike Pompeo, we will again just simplify things. Okay, so we're looking at China in the context of it having just two forms of government, the internationally funded ROC and the people-backed CPC. So here's what actually happened in reality here on Earth. The communists were part of the ROC, officially wearing uniforms, leading troops, holding military posts, and so on for 4 years during the very early pre-stages of the Japanese invasion. Then they split up when Chiang Kai-shek started multiple widespread public massacres against the communists. And then from 1936 to 1945 and further, they were back together again, officially. They were officially allies when Japan surrendered. Communists and nationalists were both participants in the struggle. So let's get back to our neocon China expert, who's even written books about this particular time period. So he's definitely going to know all this stuff. I mean, he's a top researcher, unlike me. On September 3rd, the Chinese Communist Party will orchestrate a grand military parade in Tiananmen Square to commemorate victory over Japan in World War II. Ostensibly a tribute to wartime heroism, this display is, in truth, a monumental distortion of history, a calculated fiction meant to glorify the party, vilify its contemporary adversaries, and mislead its people. He says ostensibly a tribute to wartime heroism, and then pretends to correct that notion by saying it will in fact be a distortion of history and whatever. Those things, though, even if they were true, which they aren't, don't conflict with the parade being a tribute to wartime heroism. They aren't mutually exclusive. He's playing a word game here in which his sentence structure makes it sound like he's defeated the premise, but all he's done is piled claims on top of it. Here's a simpler example of his deception. Joe said he's looking forward to going to school, but the truth is, school is not a fun place to be. Notice how much it sounds like I defeated the first sentence about Joe? I didn't. I just piled on some claims that didn't change anything about the original claim. But that's not the main point here. This lead has more serious dishonesty in it. He says that at the heart of the charade is the falsehood that the communists were the main force against the Japanese. That alone has multiple dishonest claims within. First, he's saying that the heart of the parade is that the communists were the main force against Japan. But why would that be the case? Think about it. If you see a celebration in America, do you think Americans are therefore claiming they were the main force in whatever they're celebrating? How about in France? Is France allowed to celebrate the end of the war, or is it claiming to be the principal fighting force against Nazi Germany by doing so? Very dishonest. But it gets worse. The second claim he makes is that the communists were not the principal fighting force against Japan. The communists between 1931 and 1945 were always in the military minority. They had nowhere near the troops that the official government of China had. So in a way, he's right by technicality. Obviously, they couldn't have been the main force against Japan because they literally didn't have as many troops, so how could they be? But you'll notice that's not how this claim reads. He wants you to believe that in proportion they didn't contribute as much. In other words, he's saying something that one of those bogus fact-check websites could corroborate out of a technicality, but saying it in such a way that he knows everyone reading it would understand it to mean something else. The truth, of course, is that the communists contributed an extremely high amount of effort against the Japanese. He says that the parade is meant to glorify the party. In what other country would you make this assertion? None. Every country everywhere celebrates their history from the point of view of their current selves. No one throws celebrations specifically to lionize their opponents in a civil war. Why would they? And furthermore, many Chinese people are very very clear on just how much the KMT did to fight the Japanese and the communists, and also how much they didn't do in those respects, though some of them are about to get a lot more clear after this video. So that means even though the communist celebration will be just like everywhere else on Earth, highlighting their own victories and influence more than any other groups, they don't try to erase all the efforts by the KMT. That's not a thing. China is buried in museums, books, and documents about what happened in those days. Everyone knows. So this claim is also dishonest. If anything, the KMT days are too romanticized, if you ask me. And his larger point for the first part seems to be that the amount of soldiers dying is the determiner for if China is allowed to celebrate its victory over Japan. But this is just complete dribble. In 1938, Chiang Kai-shek directly and deliberately caused the deaths of somewhere between 1 and 3 million Chinese citizens by intentionally flooding huge swaths of land, which then caused widespread repeated floods and famines, which continued to kill every year for at least 8 years. He lied about it repeatedly and then used the famine and flooding as cause to request more money from America, which he then pocketed or spent on war crimes against the communists while they were still allied with him. Those miles are facts. What's that? Don't believe me that he was actively attacking communists while they were allies? Here's just one example. In 1940, the Chinese government withdrew from the field its best equipped army of 500,000 men, commanded by a blue shirt general. Blue shirts were Chiang Kai-shek's version of the notorious brown shirts, one of his literal fascist squads. Then the army threw a powerful blockade around the rear of the communists with the intention of starving it to death while the Japanese decimated it from the front. Good job on fighting those Japanese. But this is about your weird claim about the number of deaths being related to who can celebrate victories. The reason I bring up how Chiang Kai-shek knowingly committed this unimaginable act of direct murder on Chinese citizens is to ask, Miles, does that take away from the overall effort Chinese people put into fighting Japan in general? I mean, you're saying that millions of military casualties were mostly ROC casualties. If that's true, that would be because ROC was the official government of China and had way more forces, like 5 times as much or even more depending on the exact date. So the number of people who died who were officially in the ROC and or the Communist Party doesn't change the fact that the communists fought their asses off against the Japanese. But that's not according to me, and that's not according to the big bad communists. I'm basing that off of the US government's opinion. I see this vomited all over the internet, this talking point about the communists not contributing enough or even at all to the anti-Japanese movement. It is extremely super wrong. And yes, I even know Chinese people who think this. So let's take a deeper look. At first glance, it sounds like Miles is right in saying that the communists were not the principal fighting force against Japan. They were the second principalist fighting force against Japan, like we talked about. But what's interesting about his claim here is the very specific wording. He doesn't mention that, for example, it was reported from 1941 to 1944, 42% of Japanese divisions were occupied by the communists. 42%. Not bad for only having 20% of the military size. So another way to say that, by the way, is in the years 1941 to 1944, communists, when compared to the fascists, occupied twice as many Japanese divisions. But yes, the slight majority of divisions were occupied by the 5 times as large ROC troops with American bombers and other military assistance. Not really sure that that's the gotcha you think it is. Then the article goes on to explain why his false assertion is completely true, guys. The CCP was totally inactive because they were prohibited from fighting against Japan, he says. Then he says the Japanese military and the CCP force virtually coexisted in the same swaths of Japanese-occupied North China, where there was little to no communist resistance. Even when American efforts via the Office of Strategic Services sought to arm and train guerrilla resistance in communist-held zones, the CCP obstructed operations. My God, that's a lot of bizarre revisionism. The Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, was an early version of what would later be built as the CIA. It operated widely in China, and it's quite interesting to see this alleged historian make these claims, but I'm happy he brought up the OSS, a subject which he himself wrote a book on. So let's contrast what Miles is saying in this blog post without any references or sources given with Oh, I don't know. How about we take a look at what the OSS themselves said in their own documents, shall we? War Report Office of Strategic Services, Volume 2, Operations in the Field, page 415. The Chinese national government of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek initially viewed itself as the principal front against Japan. However, as the US began to make substantial gains, China tended to relax its war efforts and to permit the US to take an increasingly heavy responsibility. Some of Chiang Kai-shek's most effective armies were in the field to operate against their communist compatriots rather than the Japanese. Wow, they even used the same word as Miles, principal, while describing how his beloved fascist nationalist armies relaxed their war efforts to let America take the driving seat while they focus on attacking communists who were in an alliance with them for the entirety of the war. Whoops! But that's not all. The OSS actually complained constantly about how hard it was to get the ROC to fight the Japanese all throughout the war. The entire war report mentions this again and again and again, but I'll just give you a taste of how the OSS actually viewed the ROC's efforts. OSS was faced with the problem of initiating operations against the enemy in a country whose prime concern was to use the striking power supplied by the Americans against dissident elements within the country. Kinda sounds like the nationalists were trying desperately to not fight Japan, Miles. Here, the OSS says of the ROC, the Chinese army was incapable of taking the offensive against the enemy. Or how about this declassified internal US government document from 1944? Surely you've seen this, award-winning researcher. In communist China, there is 1. A base of military operations in and near Japan's largest military concentration and second largest industrial base. 2. Perhaps the most abundant supply of intelligence on the Japanese enemy available to us anywhere. And 3. The most cohesive, disciplined, and aggressively anti-Japanese regime in China. Ouch! That's about as clear as it gets. So the communists were out there fighting the Japanese, and meanwhile the OSS could barely get the ROC to lift a finger. Oh, this part of the war report is good too. You can see that not only the US knew Chen was running a fascist government, but that the US was trying to run that fascist government directly. In Oriental Gestapo, the Daily organization, the blue shirts, lacked strong motivation for aiding the Allied war effort, and its operatives were totally untrained. So the US used what it called a mixture of bribes and threats to force Chiang Kai-shek's Gestapo, their word, not mine, Miles, to take part in the defense against the Japanese. By the way, if you're an actual history buff, unlike Miles here, I recommend you read the entire OSS war report. It's very, very long, but it's just filled with stuff like this. All the hard work the US had to do year after year to beg, bribe, threaten, or otherwise force Chiang Kai-shek and his Gestapo to even participate in the war at all. They were preoccupied with chasing down and killing communists, which is one of the reasons they lost the Civil War. The Chinese people, who Chiang Kai-shek had completely forgotten about, wanted to go to war against the invading country, not against other Chinese people. Or what about this one? Another OSS report about the quality of the ROC's soldiers and how they are becoming less and less useful. The effectiveness of China as a wartime ally of the United States, except for the pinning down of Japanese troops, is decidedly limited and is steadily deteriorating. The main contributing factor seems to be 1. War weariness, 2. China's vast armies are so relatively ineffective because the lack of general national patriotism, and of course the low morale because of lack of national consciousness, brutal methods of recruiting and training, and exploitation of the common soldier by his officers. Brutal methods of recruiting. Yes, ROC citizens were often literally kidnapped and chained together and then thrown into combat to die. Meanwhile, the communists couldn't even find enough supplies and weapons for all the troops because people were showing up volunteering in droves. The fascist side had low morale. They were ineffective and corrupt. Meanwhile, it seems, according to the United States government, not me, the communists were cohesive, disciplined, aggressively anti-Japanese. So why didn't you mention any of this? It's almost like you're a supreme clown. Or how about in 1943 when a US ambassador told the Secretary of State that there has been a clear and disturbing deterioration in the condition of the Chinese armies due to undernourishment, disease, and inaction. Inaction? In 1943? Why were they inactive in 1943, Miles? The communists were occupying 42% of the Japanese divisions in the north, so why were the nationalists inactive? Why would official White House documents show that, Miles? Or how about this operative account in With the OSS in China, which highlights the lies he was told about China compared to the truth he found when he was there. Careful now, Miles, this one might be a little triggering. What we knew about the war in China was what the nationalist propaganda machine, epitomized by Madame Chiang Kai-shek, elected to tell us. She told us of great battles raging against the Japanese, when at most, there were only skirmishes. The Chinese communists were waging the real war against the Japanese, and Chang was playing a waiting game, hoping the communists would be weakened by the Japanese. He was stockpiling the war materials being sent by the US for use against the communists when the Japanese were defeated. Chang did not want any Americans who had been to China before to return there because they would not be influenced by him and his wife. He especially did not want American agents nosing around to find out how little the Chinese were doing militarily against the Japanese. Ouch, Miles, this has got to be stinging by now. It goes on to talk about the headquarters of the nationalists, which at the time was Chongqing. In Chongqing, there was regular Japanese bombing raids. The KMT would wait until the Japanese planes were long gone, and then they filled the sky with anti-aircraft fire as a morale booster. If they fired when the Japanese planes were overhead, it would give away the locations of the guns, and the Japanese would bomb them. The guns were being saved to fight the communists. How many people died by bombing raids in Chongqing again? Well, at least those Japanese bombers got to see some fireworks behind them as they left. Miles, oh Miles, you really are a great researcher and you deserve your awards. Oh, and what's this, Miles? From the Second Secretary of Embassy in China. As you know, there have been uprisings in Guizhou which appear to at least be in part directed against the national government. There's those people slowly rising up more and more against the ROC. And what were those troops up to anyway? Down at the front, there's very little activity. Malnutrition is apparently prevalent among the troops. Sickness is increasing, and the spirit of the troops is said to be fading. In the occupied areas, the Japanese, with a few hundred troops, are able to sit behind their elaborate fortifications and contain thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of idle Chinese troops. Idle troops. More and more idle troops. But to be fair, I suppose this shouldn't be too surprising, because this is how Chang ran his government really from the very beginning. In 1935, before the invasion, Japan threatened war against China. Anti-Japanese protests broke out in multiple cities. They were supported by the communists, but were broken up by the ROC, who also arrested protesters. New political parties were springing up, specifically and only because the nationalists refused to defend China against Japan. Nothing about that in your little blog post for some reason. Then in 1936, when it was looking Japan's invasion was imminent, various parts of China, due to Chang's disinterest in protecting China, formed not just anti-Japanese political parties, but actual military armies. Chang's response was to block them with his troops and then bomb them, and then of course ordered the suppression of all anti-Japanese movements in China, and of course increased attacks against communists. As Japan spread death across China in 1937, Chang did such notoriously treacherous things as abandoning Nanjing to be plunged into utter destruction while signaling his indecision and hesitancy to the world. The communists at the time, by the way, were calling for declaration of war against Japan. The Chinese communists were still in no position to challenge Chang. They were sealed off from southern China by a 500,000-man KMT blockade. But, bottled up as they were in northern China, the Reds were waging a remarkably effective guerrilla war against the Japanese. The Japanese army tried to force the communists back with a scorched earth policy that ravaged the countryside and drove more people into Mao's ranks. And how did that compare to the fascist nationalist side? Along the KMT Japanese front in the south, there was little action because Chang's armies were under orders to keep a safe distance between them and the enemy. The only KMT armies that did fight were those under Joseph Stilwell's control in Myanmar. They fought only occasionally, but when they could be coerced into fighting, they did well. Everything still well accomplished he did over the strenuous objections of Chiang Kai-shek. As news was leaking about the hundreds of thousands of people who were brutally massacred in Nanjing, who was the biggest threat to Japan, according to US Marine accounts? It is interesting to note that whenever there is a lull in active Japanese offensive operations, the guerrilla bands spring into instant life. The guerrillas undoubtedly comprise the most pressing and insoluble problem now faced by the Japanese army. Guerrillas, not the official armies of China, that's for sure. Want some more? Here's that US General Joseph Stilwell talking about your precious nationalist contributions to the anti-Japanese war and the ROC's attitude towards all the hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars America lent to it. I never heard Chiang Kai-shek say a single thing that indicated gratitude to the president or to our country for the help we were extending to him. Invariably, when anything was promised, he would want more. Invariably, he would complain about the small amount of material that was being furnished. He would complain that the Chinese had been fighting for 6 or 7 years, and yet we gave them practically nothing. It would, of course, been undiplomatic to go into the nature of the military effort Chiang Kai-shek had made since 1938. It was practically zero. Wow, that is damning and clear from a US general, Stilwell of all people, who really knew. Now, we can always find criticisms of every side in a war, so this all, as you know, doesn't constitute proof that you're totally wrong. History is not a hard science. But Miles, it does seem a little strange how easy it was for me to go through my timelines and research materials and find solid praise of the communists, particularly in their struggle against the Japanese. I mean, I found it from the OSS, from the military, from newspapers, from politicians, in previously classified documents, State Department, ambassadors. Very clear. Does that mean every communist was the best anti-Japanese soldier and every non-communist ROC soldier was an inactive chicken merely pretending to fight the Japanese like in Chongqing? Of course not. That's because history is complicated. But what it definitely does mean, Miles, is that the communists in China have every goddamn right to celebrate their enormous role in defending their homeland from Japan in what we sometimes call World War II. But believe it or not, this cult guy has even more stupid. The brutal killing of Office of Strategic Services agent Captain John Birch stands as a grim testament to the CCP's duplicity and hostility towards genuine anti-Japanese resistance that threatened its ambitions. For those of you who don't know who this is, he was a OSS soldier, roughly equivalent to a CIA agent today, who was sent after the war's end to formally receive a minor station of Japanese surrender. He was killed by a communist soldier during this process. John Birch died after Japan's surrender, so Miles is just being dishonest. Also, his death had nothing to do with Japan, so why are you pretending that it did? And as far as I know, John Birch's death was admitted to be wrong from all sides involved, and no one is trying to justify it. But it is worth mentioning, by the way, John Birch's small slice of responsibility in his own death. Birch threatened atomic bombs against the communists if he were harmed, grabbed a communist escort by the back of the collar, called them bandits, and also refused to disarm himself for passage through the area. Then one of them shot him. Now, I obviously don't agree with this killing, but the point is, describing that as a grim testament to the CCP's duplicity and hostility towards genuine anti-Japanese resistance that's threatening its ambitions is about the most misleading thing I've ever seen. His death had literally nothing to do with anti-Japanese resistance at all. And by the way, after considering all the available data, the Office of the Theater Judge Advocate carefully reconstructed the case. Birch was found guilty of poor judgment and failure to take proper precautions, and his superiors were found guilty of improper coordination with the communist forces. The communists were indicted for the killing. The communists issued a statement of regret. Now, how you could put this death as an example of, again, hostility towards genuine anti-Japanese resistance is absolutely ridiculous. And you can't feign ignorance on this one, because in addition to finding this evidence in the original sources, I also find this information in your book that you wrote yourself. So you definitely know that this was not at all the CCP being hostile towards genuine anti-Japanese resistance, but you say it anyway. Then Miles goes on. The communists' rare foray into combat, i.e. the much-touted 100 Regiments Offensive of 1940, was neither decisive nor heroic. To fake its anti-Japanese feat, the CCP claimed massive Japanese casualties because of this campaign, as many as 46,000. But Japan's casualty records suggest the real number was less than 500. Oh, Japan's records suggest that, do they? Well, we know that they're super upfront about their statistics, right? Or no, I'm sorry, did you say Japan? They're notoriously opaque and dishonest about their casualties and kill counts for nearly every single battle everywhere in China. They lie about the Nanjing massacre, about Unit 731, about their scorched earth policy, about literally every aspect of the range of their crimes. But for some reason, you take their word here. Or do you? No, you don't even take their word for it. Your number, less than 500, seems to be you just adding these two numbers from Wikipedia. 276 KIAs from the 4th Independent Mixed Brigade and 133 from the 2nd. Interesting how you intentionally skip the first part of that, which clearly says no figure about total casualties. So you're just taking a tiny part of it from 2 brigades and claiming that that's the whole picture. Top Wikipedia researcher. You also magically ignored this part right below it, which says the medical department in just the North China Front Army, which was not the entire fighting force, estimated losses at over 2,000. So even when you're dishonestly cherry-picking data, even in that dishonorable act, you're not even content to get the lowest estimate from the obviously biased and most dishonest side. No, you can't accept their estimates, so you just combine 2 tiny parts of the engagement and pretend that that's the extent of it. Disgusting. And what about Western estimates? Weird, you didn't mention those. This one says over 40,000. It's almost like understanding history is hard. Representing it accurately and fairly is even harder, and it takes actual integrity to do so. The truth is, we don't know the full extent of the casualties, and we likely never will. Japan continues to push against accuracy and honesty, while government-run people like you intentionally, knowingly deceive the public. Something between a few thousand and many tens of thousands were killed. That's all we know based on these sources. To narrow it down, we need better sources than those listed here. So to pretend like it was under 500 people in this very dishonest way is an offensive slap, not only in the faces of Chinese, but even the Japanese. I mean, Miles is just reckless. Then the dishonest rag article goes on to make bizarre claims about how modern China's pretending the US and the communists had a great and strong alliance, and how secretly they're deep enemies, which is completely false. I mean, I'm not gonna make you guys all sit through yet another long round of sources because this point is so flimsy and not really very important. But long story short, the communists were open to cooperation with the US, and they did cooperate for a while, and then eventually the US abandoned support for the communists and intensified support for the fascists. And rather interestingly, while this amateur blog post says that the communists targeted US personnel for assassination without any sources, the US nearly did assassinate Chiang Kai-shek. Not only that, but the amazing US fascist alliance, which Miles describes as the true partnership between the US and Chiang's nationalists, included the US assassinating KMT members and privately lamenting repeatedly about how corrupt, useless, and greedy that the KMT were. But what they complained about even more than that was how unwilling the KMT was to fight Japan, the direct opposite of the entire point of Miles's article. And speaking of that true partnership between the US and fascist ROC, what did the Vice President of the United States say about this alliance? He predicted that leadership of China could not be done by Chiang and would likely come from revolution. Sounds like a smart guy. Chiang, at best, is a short-term investment. It is not believed that he has the intelligence or political strength to run post-war China. The leaders of post-war China will be brought forward by evolution or revolution, and it now seems more likely the latter. Henry A. Wallace, Vice President of the United States of America. He's saying the the leader of post-war China couldn't be Chiang Kai-shek. It could be a different, newer version of a KMT leader, but most likely a communist revolutionary leader. He was exactly right. The true alliance was so tight that the President of the United States of America was ready and willing to simply assassinate Chiang Kai-shek if it caused any issues. President Roosevelt told Stilwell if he couldn't get along with Chiang and couldn't replace him, to get rid of him. That's right, simply assassinate the other side of this true alliance if Chiang didn't cooperate. And yes, there was a detailed plan on how precisely Chiang was to be assassinated. So there definitely was an alliance, but it was not the pretty happy alliance Miles alludes to in his article. Not at all. Then the blog post contradicts itself. It first says that the Communist Party claims to honor 15 million Chinese victims of the war, and then just 3 paragraphs later attacks the party, saying among other things it should honor the millions of unarmed civilians who endured occupation. You just said that they were doing that, Miles. Maybe try reading your random propaganda before sending it to your Korean cult bosses. They are honoring the unarmed civilians. He also says that China remains silent about people who perished at its own hands over the decades. I mean, not really, no. Supposedly you're Chinese, so I think you could just search for this stuff, but some subjects are more sensitive than others. But the fact is, the Chinese government has admitted many mistakes in the past and has gone through a lot of posthumous rehabilitations, loosening of dogmatic historical views, and so on. Do I think that they should stop doing that? That they've done everything that they need to do? No. There was a lot of bad things that happened in China on all sides, and it's incumbent on the government of China to rectify, atone for, heal, or otherwise calm the wrongdoings of the past, be they through corruption or bad policy or malice or incompetence or whatever, you name it. But the best way to make sure that they never do that is to turn every single thing that happened in history into the worst condemnation of the Communist Party imaginable. Try desperately to paint everything they do in the worst light, even celebrations of the victories of previous generations, like you're doing right now. That will ensure that they're always on damage control and never able to grow their legacy. But that's really the point, isn't it, Miles? So while you pretend to care about truth, you fight against that truth by pushing a wacky, flimsy propaganda message. All Chinese soldiers who fought against Japan should be honored, not just the communists, the nationalists as well. Because even though they were, by multiple accounts, less active, less effective, less disciplined, and repeatedly idle, and even pretending to fight, those things don't change the fact that war is not a simple black and white subject. Chiang certainly prevented soldiers from fighting back, which caused massive physical and psychological trauma to the Chinese people, repeatedly, at great annoyance to the Western allies and even more so to the Chinese. That's true. But the point is, every soldier, even those who in the end didn't achieve much, if they contributed anything to the liberation of China, should be revered to that extent. And as a history lover, I greedily find all of their presences enriching and fascinating. So honor those who defended themselves and stood up for China, no matter under which flag. Then, of course, the article goes way out of bounds yet again, saying the celebration should include the Flying Tigers and the OSS. That is rich. The Flying Tigers were a group of American pilots who were in a gray zone between actual US military and volunteer US mercenaries due to some boring legal technicalities. They participated in the anti-Japanese war for about 6 months. When they were ordered to increase their combat risks, they had a near mutiny. Then, when they were to be properly integrated into the Air Force, which would have resulted in reduced pay, among other things, all except a handful of them quit entirely. The US Air Force then quietly absorbed the remaining deserted Flying Tigers. They got in total about 500 kills and lost about 70 aircraft and 15 men. So I guess, yeah, thanks. I mean, it definitely was helpful. Nothing at all compared to what the Chinese contributed, but I'm not going to sit here and say it wasn't helpful. I mean, what this has to do with Chinese people celebrating China's victory over Japan is a bit of a stretch, but I'll allow it, I guess. And then, of course, he says the OSS should be celebrated as well. Exactly. Just like how when Americans celebrate the Revolutionary War, we totally take time to mention the Dutch Republic. I mean, they were there, they did stuff, and according to Miles, they should be celebrated for that. It all makes perfect sense. Notice how desperate this article is? The only people who aren't allowed to celebrate China's victory against Japan are the people of China. The only government not allowed to participate in celebration is the government of China. This is why you're known as a supreme clown, Miles. He also says says, a truthful commemoration would also acknowledge the victims of communist tyranny, the real cost of the CCP's rise to power. What does that have to do with a war with Japan? Nothing. No matter what the cause, cost, or benefits were of the CCP's rise to power, that doesn't change that China is allowed to, and should, celebrate its triumph over the fascist Japan, whose numbers you trust so much, except for when you fudged even them. Then, mercifully, finally, the blog post ends with, what will unfold on September 3rd is not remembrance, but propaganda, an insult draped in flags and uniforms, parading not history but deception. It is a lie in motion. Like all lies, it demands to be exposed. And there you have it, a propaganda piece published by literal false messiah cult calling China's World War II celebration deception because several lies and misrepresentations that it makes. Miles wants you to know that the memory of those who fought Japanese fascism will be sullied if you don't disproportionately celebrate Chinese fascism and deny the entire generation of Chinese people alive today and their government the right to celebrate victory over fascism. What a stand-up guy. And finally, the Supreme Propaganda article is done. So to be clear, China has great reason to celebrate the end of World War II. Many soldiers and innocent people died on all sides. In the end, the ROC's incompetence, abandonment of Sun Yat-sen's policies, and deaf ear to the people was too much for the masses, who rose up province by province in support of the communists. Like it or not. What followed was a painful ripping of the bandage during a turbulent, but in the end unifying experience of growing a new country within ancient China. So, Chinese people, including Communist Party members and government officials, celebrate loudly, bring on the parades, and let every naysaying, dishonest moron like Miles be silenced by the cheers. He'll no doubt be working on his next back-of-the-napkin hit piece against you, but that's what he does. Sucks up to the US military while obfuscating facts so he can grift off allegedly being Chinese. But unfortunately for the supreme clown, I'm always out there lurking in the shadows, ready to strike when anti-Chinese propaganda shows up. By the way, all the research for this video was done by me. I have a lot more ammo just like this sitting in my back pocket, ready for the latest moron like Miles to come talking rubbish. If you want to support my channel and my upcoming book, consider joining as a member. Making these videos is back to taking a lot of my time. So if you liked the video, please support the channel. Until next time, China, congratulations on winning the war. I'm Nathan Rich. Thanks everybody. 谢谢.